She didn't forget her place. She remembered exactly who had hurt her brothers, who silenced Louis when he cried, who humiliated George behind closed doors. So when they told Princess Charlotte to bow, she stood still, didn't blink, didn't bend. And Camilla's son? He slapped her, right there, on palace ground, in full view of the guard. But the moment his hand landed, the royal guard broke formation, stepped forward, and shouted what no royal child had ever heard before. "Arrest him now!" And what happened next silenced the entire corridor. So before we show you the moment protocol shattered, when title meant nothing, and silence finally broke, would you have stood still too? Tell us in the comments. Tap like, hit subscribe, and turn on the bell. Because this wasn't just about a slap. This was the day Charlotte stood for all three of them, and the guard stood with her. The Rose Antechamber was never meant for ceremony. It was a buffer room, a quiet, marble-trimmed space with oil paintings older than the grandchildren who now crossed it, a transition zone between the private corridors and the public gallery. Today, it held 6 people, and a memory that would be impossible to erase. Princess Charlotte stood beside a silver-gilded chair, her posture perfect, hands clasped loosely in front of her coat. Navy blue wool, buttoned to the throat. Patent shoes, polished to the point of reflection. She looked ready, but she wasn't rehearsing. She hadn't said a word in 5 minutes. To anyone else, she looked disciplined, focused. To the man in the red tunic posted silently by the far wall, Sergeant Declan Hartley, Coldstream Guards, she looked like something else, resolved. She wasn't twitching, wasn't fidgeting. Not once had she fiddled with the hem of her sleeve or smoothed her braid. She just stood, not stiffly, but still enough to worry anyone trained to read posture under pressure. This was supposed to be a simple walkthrough. A dress rehearsal for a small exhibit, the Royal Youth and Heritage Initiative. Charlotte had been chosen, hand-picked really, to symbolically lead the opening. Nothing public, no cameras, just aides, a short speech, and a corridor lined with photo panels from the Queen's own childhood. It was the kind of thing she normally excelled at, but this time something was different. Across the room, Camilla's son had entered 10 minutes ago. No announcement. No briefing packet, just a quiet nod to the aides, as if his presence needed no explanation. He hadn't spoken to Charlotte. He hadn't needed to. She'd noticed him the second he arrived, and though her head never turned, Sergeant Hartley had seen the way her body subtly shifted. Not in fear, not in reaction, in preparation, because this wasn't the first time. 3 weeks ago, Prince George had returned from a private luncheon with swollen eyes. He claimed allergies. Catherine didn't press. 2 months before that, Louis had gone silent after a quiet scolding in the East Conservatory. "Tantrum," Camilla's son had said. "Boys need sharper boundaries." Charlotte had once been cornered in the Queen's garden with no aides present, just him, and that steady, smiling tone. "You don't need to speak, darling. You just need to obey." She had said nothing then, had nodded, had curtsied, had internalized it, but not today. She wasn't older now, not really, but she had learned, not just from what was said, from what was repeated, from what was never stopped. That's what today was. Not a rehearsal, a line. And she wasn't afraid of being punished. She was afraid of staying quiet. Sergeant Hartley had served the Crown for 7 years. He had stood guard beside coffins and carriages, beside soldiers and sovereigns. He knew what tension felt like, the kind that brewed in silence, not sound. He felt it now, not loud, just present. He watched Charlotte, watched the subtle tightness in her fingers, the absolute stillness in her shoulders. And he watched the man across the room, Camilla's son, watch her in return, like he was waiting for something. The aide cleared her throat, adjusted her clipboard. "All right," she said softly, stepping forward. "Let's move through positioning once more, if we may. Princess Charlotte, you'll begin at this mark." She gestured at the golden tile seam on the floor. "Then pause, bow as rehearsed, and proceed down the line of display panels to—" "I heard," Charlotte said. It was the first time she'd spoken since entering the room. And not rude, not clipped, just clear. The aide blinked, then nodded. "Of course." Behind her, the other protocol officer scribbled a note. Charlotte stepped forward slowly, stopped at the mark. Camilla's son shifted his weight, not a step, just a lean, hands clasped behind his back like he was waiting to assess posture. The aide gave the gentle cue. "And the bow?" Charlotte didn't move. Her hands remained clasped. Her spine remained tall. She looked straight ahead, not at the display, not at the aide, not at him. Sergeant Hartley didn't shift, didn't raise a brow, but his hand, the one closest to the fold of his tunic, curled slightly tighter. This wasn't defiance. It was decision, and it had already begun. The aide's tone remained light, rehearsed, careful not to overstep. She held her clipboard close to her chest as she repeated the line Charlotte had already heard twice. "And now, your bow, just like last time, Your Highness." Charlotte didn't blink. She stood alone in the centre of the antechamber. Not a stage, not a crowd. Just cold tile, polished until the gold-veined seams gleamed under the chandelier. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, on the seam marked by the protocol officer's toe. Except she wasn't moving. Her hands were still folded, perfectly positioned in front of her coat. Her shoes were aligned. Her spine was straight. Nothing about her posture suggested rebellion. Only refusal. A pause bloomed. At first, no one noticed it. The aide hesitated only slightly, smiled again. "Just a small one, Charlotte, and then we'll begin the walkthrough." Still no movement. From the corner of the room, Camilla's son shifted slightly, just enough to place both his hands behind his back, like a man inspecting a mistake. Sergeant Declan Hartley didn't move at all, but his peripheral focus tightened. This silence wasn't accidental. Another beat passed. The protocol officer coughed lightly, tried to diffuse the moment with bureaucracy. "Your Highness, the courtesy is noted in today's programme. It aligns with the ceremonial handoff from the Crown." Charlotte exhaled slowly. Not a sigh, a controlled breath. Still, she didn't bow. A low murmur passed between the two aides near the door. It wasn't judgment, it was confusion. Charlotte had never skipped protocol before. Not in rehearsals, not in family settings, not even during school visits. But today, right now, she stood still like she was waiting for a reason not to move. No defiance, no tension, just a quiet, unbearable stillness. Camilla's son took 2 steps forward. They were measured, intentional. Not aggressive, but close enough that it changed the dynamic in the room. He didn't speak yet, but his presence altered the weight of the silence. Charlotte didn't turn her head, didn't acknowledge him. The aide stepped in again, voice tighter now. "Your Highness, is everything all right?" Charlotte's eyes flicked once to the woman's face, then back to the centre line of the floor. "I'm fine." 3 words, barely above a whisper, but they broke the room like a pin in crystal. Camilla's son tilted his head slightly, then bow. It wasn't a request, it wasn't loud either, but the tone scraped. Sergeant Hartley's eyes narrowed just slightly, not in suspicion, but in calculation. The dynamic had shifted. Charlotte's posture didn't change, her lips pressed together. Her hands remained folded, now tighter than before. "I will when I'm," she said softly. A longer silence followed. This was no longer rehearsal. This was confrontation. Except only one side was escalating. The aides were frozen. No one wanted to be the first to call attention to what was becoming very obvious. Princess Charlotte was refusing a bow. And not because she was distracted, not because she was nervous, because she meant to. Sergeant Hartley remained silent, but the weight of the room had already moved toward him. He could feel it in the corner of his eye, every person in the room waiting for someone else to take the next step, waiting to see who would speak, who would command, who would lose control. Charlotte didn't flinch, didn't tremble. She simply stood there, still, watching nothing, giving no one what they expected. Camilla's son closed the distance without announcing it. Not fast, not loud, just a measured step to Charlotte's side, close enough that his shadow crossed the front of her coat. He angled his body slightly away from the aides, turning his voice down so it wouldn't carry. "You're embarrassing the family," he said. It wasn't sharp. It wasn't raised. It was worse than that. Quiet, confident, delivered like a correction that had already been decided. Charlotte's eyes didn't lift. Her chin stayed level. Her fingers tightened once, then relaxed again. "I bow when people are kind," she said. The sentence landed softly, but it changed everything. He let out a small, humorless breath through his nose. "You're a child," he replied. "You don't get to decide that." She turned her head then, just enough to look at him. Not up, not down, straight on. "You weren't kind to George," she said. The room didn't hear it, but Sergeant Declan Hartley saw the man's jaw tighten. "That's not true," he snapped back too quickly. "Don't repeat things you don't understand." Charlotte didn't argue, didn't list dates, didn't raise her voice. "You shouted at him," she said calmly, "in the library. You said he should stop acting like he mattered so much." One of the aides stiffened, catching the shift in tone without catching the words. Camilla's son glanced toward them, then back at Charlotte. His voice dropped further. "You are not to speak about family matters." She didn't move away. "You yelled at Louis when he cried," she continued. "You told him boys don't cry unless they want to be weak." That did it. His hand came up, not to strike, not yet, but to point. A sharp, scolding motion inches from her shoulder. "That is enough," he said. "You're inventing nonsense because someone has filled your head." "No," Charlotte said. "You said it." There was no tremor in her voice, no plea, no anger, just certainty. Sergeant Hartley shifted his weight for the first time. It was subtle, so subtle most people wouldn't notice. A fractional adjustment of stance. But it meant his line of sight was now clear, unobstructed, trained on the man's hands. The aide stepped forward, trying to reclaim control of the moment. "Perhaps we should pause." Camilla's son lifted a finger without looking at her. A silent command. She stopped. Charlotte's hands were still folded, but the skin across her knuckles had gone pale. She didn't step back. She didn't retreat. "I'm not bowing," she said quietly. "Not to someone who does that." "You think this is bravery," he murmured, "standing still and defying people who care about you?" "I think it's honesty," she replied. That was when his tone changed. The softness dropped away, replaced by something edged and personal. "You are being difficult on purpose." She shook her head once. "I'm being careful." Behind them, the protocol officer cleared his throat, uneasy. "Sir, perhaps—" "I'm handling this," Camilla's son snapped, louder now. Charlotte didn't look at the officer. She didn't look at the aides. Her focus stayed on the man in front of her. "You don't get to scare my brothers," she said, "and then ask me to bow." For a heartbeat, he said nothing. Then he laughed, short, incredulous. "You think you're protecting them?" "I am," Charlotte said. That was the moment Sergeant Hartley recognized. The shift from correction to hostility wasn't dramatic. It was controlled, focused. The kind of escalation that didn't announce itself until it was too late. Camilla's son leaned closer, lowering his voice again. "You are going to regret this," he said. "You don't understand the position you're putting yourself in." Charlotte didn't step back. "I understand," she said. "I just don't agree." Silence spread outward from them, thick and uncomfortable. The refusal was no longer a pause in rehearsal. It was a line being drawn, quietly, deliberately, and everyone in the room felt it. The aide didn't know what she was interrupting. She simply saw a cluster of silence forming and moved to dissolve it. Protocol demanded flow, and flow demanded Charlotte's bow. That was all this was meant to be. A rehearsed gesture in a quiet chamber. "Your Highness," the aide said, gentler now. "The bow, please." Charlotte didn't respond. She kept her eyes ahead, spine straight, hands still clasped. "Charlotte," came a second voice, this time from the protocol officer, more direct. "The gesture must be completed for the order of ceremony, even in rehearsal." No one raised their voice. No one made a scene. But the room had stopped breathing. Camilla's son remained at her side, arms crossed now, watching her like she was something broken in need of correction. Charlotte's gaze never lifted. The aide stepped forward and tried to smile past the tension. "Just a small one, dear, as a formality." Charlotte turned her head slightly. This time she spoke. "I bow to the crown." A pause. Then she added, "But I won't bow to someone who mistreats my brothers." It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. The words floated through the chamber like dropped glass, whole and unmistakable. The aide froze mid-step. The protocol officer lowered his clipboard. Camilla's son's jaw tensed, just once, but his posture didn't change. He looked straight ahead, refusing to glance sideways, refusing to acknowledge that the words had been heard by more than just the girl. But they had. The assistant liaison near the door had gone completely still. One of the security aides at the entrance adjusted his stance, not because he was alarmed, but because something had shifted in the air. Something heavy. Sergeant Hartley didn't flinch. He had heard every word, and he'd seen what came before it. Charlotte stood alone, not elevated, not emboldened, simply unmoved. Her voice was quiet, her logic devastating. She didn't accuse, she didn't dramatize. She stated, "I won't bow to someone who mistreats my brothers." There were no names, no screaming, no crying, just truth delivered like an observation, cold, unapologetic. Camilla's son turned toward her now, fully, for the first time. His expression stayed carefully neutral, but his eyes, sharpened, tight, unreadable, betrayed something deeper, humiliation. Not because of the refusal, because of who had refused and how. This wasn't rebellion, this was exposure, and it came from a child. A silence swallowed the room, not one of anticipation, but of recognition. Everyone had seen it, heard it, understood it. The only question left now was how he would respond. Camilla's son didn't speak for 5 full seconds. But it was the kind of silence that didn't mean surrender. It meant restraint, barely. He turned his head slightly, just enough to glance at the aides, then back to Charlotte. His voice came cold, clipped. "You've been fed poison." Charlotte didn't respond. Her gaze was steady, her hands still folded. She didn't seem shaken, not even now. He stepped closer. "This isn't a game, Charlotte." She didn't move. "You've let someone turn you into a puppet. I don't know if it was your nanny or your mother, but I'm telling you now." His voice dropped. "You're not old enough to understand who you're defying." Sergeant Hartley saw it. Not the words, but the way the weight shifted in his hips. The subtle forward lean, the tension building not in his voice, but his posture. Charlotte said nothing for a moment. Then, "I know exactly who I'm defying." That line cracked his composure. "You think that makes you brave?" he snapped. "Standing here, refusing a bow, like it means something?" Charlotte's head tilted slightly. "It does mean something," she said. He barked a low, bitter laugh. "You're a spoiled little girl, pretending to be noble." She didn't flinch. "You're pretending I haven't done anything wrong," she said. "I'm just not pretending with you anymore." That was it. His face tightened. Not all at once, but in stages. Brow first, then lips, then jaw. His hand lifted sharply. Not high, not fast, but enough. Enough that the room felt it. He reached toward her. 2 fingers aimed loosely at the upper arm, just shy of contact. Not a grab, not a shove. Just an attempt to assert control. Charlotte's entire body reacted. Not by shrinking, not by jerking back, but with a sudden inhale and a quick, clean step to the side. "Don't touch me!" The words weren't screamed, but they stopped the room like a slammed door. She didn't plead. She didn't panic, she instructed. And that's when Sergeant Hartley moved. He didn't break position, not yet. But his boot shifted an inch outward, heel angled slightly toward the tension point. Camilla's son froze mid-motion, fingers still in the air. Everyone had seen it. The aides, the protocol officer, the assistant liaison, the security detail near the door. He hadn't touched her, but he'd tried, and she'd stopped him. "Don't," she repeated, this time louder. "You don't get to touch me because you're angry." He turned toward her fully now, eyes sharp, lips pressed tight. "You're out of control." I'm standing still, Charlotte replied, and making a fool of yourself. I'm telling the truth. The room didn't know what to do with this. This wasn't tantrum. This wasn't drama. This was a child refusing to give up her ground, and an adult unable to take it without crossing a line. Sergeant Hartley's fingers flexed, once against the inside of his palm. It was coming. He didn't know when, but he knew the next second would decide everything. It didn't happen with a shout. There was no warning, no final insult, no sound to break the moment first, just motion. Camilla's son moved like he meant to make a point, hand rising sharply, shoulder tensing just before the follow-through. It wasn't a shove. It wasn't a grab. It was a slap. His palm struck the left side of Charlotte's face with a clean, open-handed snap that echoed against the polished walls. The aides didn't gasp. They didn't have time. Charlotte's head snapped to the side. Her body rocked half a step, but she didn't fall. Her patent shoes slid against the tile, squeaking faintly. Her braid swung with the momentum. She righted herself in a heartbeat. No cry, no collapse, just stillness. But the red print on her cheek began to rise almost immediately. Every person in the room was frozen. The aide's clipboard slid an inch down her side. The protocol officer's pen fell from his fingers and clicked onto the tile like a punctuation mark no one had written. Charlotte blinked once, then straightened fully. She didn't look at him. She didn't touch her face. She simply looked ahead. Sergeant Declan Hartley was already in motion before the shock had finished echoing. 1 second, the man in the red tunic was an ornament to the room, silent, still, forgettable. The next! He stepped between Camilla's son and the girl he'd just struck with a force that changed the air. His boots hit the tile hard, not fast, but deliberate, the kind of movement that broke protocol only when something irreversible had occurred. Charlotte didn't look up. She didn't flinch. She stood exactly where she'd been, the red blooming across her cheekbone like a brand. Hartley raised his voice, not loud, sharp, clean, final. "Arrest him, now!" Every head turned, every aide froze. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the sound of shoes, the heavier kind, echoed from the far corner. Security. 2 members of the Internal Protection Unit, standing just outside the chamber, had already begun moving. The second Hartley's boot shifted. They didn't ask questions. Camilla's son turned as they approached, eyes wide. "What are you doing?" Hartley didn't answer. He simply raised one gloved hand and pointed, open-palmed, at the man now backing away from him. "Subject has committed a physical assault on a minor member of the royal family," Hartley said, voice formal. One of the security men pulled a radio from his hip. "Confirmed incident. We need corridor clearance, 2-person containment, live witness." "I am not being removed," Camilla's son snapped. "You are," Hartley replied, "and you'll walk or you'll be carried." The aides hadn't moved. The protocol officer looked pale. Charlotte still hadn't spoken, still hadn't looked at anyone, but she hadn't left. She was standing behind the guard now, safely behind him. Not hidden, shielded. "You don't get to overrule me," Camilla's son barked, turning back to Hartley. "You're ceremonial. You wear wool. I am family." Hartley didn't blink. "And you just struck a 10-year-old girl in a government building." One of the security officers stepped forward and produced a set of soft restriction cuffs. "I will not be treated like a criminal," he started. "You just became one," Hartley cut in. The second security officer moved in behind Camilla's son now. His hands twitched once at his sides, but he didn't resist. Not yet. "Unbelievable," he muttered. "She made me do it." Charlotte heard that. Everyone did. Hartley's jaw twitched. He took 1 half-step closer, enough that his tone no longer echoed. It landed. "You hit her. That's all anyone will remember." The cuffs were fastened. No one moved to stop it. Not the aides, not the staff, not even the junior protocol liaison, who looked like she might cry. Camilla's son didn't shout as they led him from the room. He just stared, wide-eyed, disbelieving, as if the laws he'd lived above had just remembered him. Charlotte's gaze never left the floor. She was still behind the guard, but not because she was hiding. Because that's where he had placed himself the second she needed someone to. He didn't walk out quietly. Camilla's son twisted halfway in the grip of the security officers before they reached the door, his voice rising, the words cutting sharp across the antechamber, like they could undo what had already happened. "You don't understand what you're doing." The younger officer held his grip firm at the elbow, neutral and restrained. "You've been placed under protective detainment pending internal review. Do not resist." "You can't detain me. I'm family." "You're not above safeguarding law," Hartley said. His voice wasn't raised. He didn't need to raise it anymore. Charlotte stood behind him, unmoving. The red on her cheek had deepened now, a flush bordered by an emerging edge of bruising that would purple by morning. The man turned his head sharply as they reached the threshold. "Do you know who I am?" Hartley didn't look away. "Yes," he said. "And you hit a child." The words dropped like iron. The second aide stepped forward now, more out of obligation than courage. "Perhaps we should pause. Speak to Her Majesty." "No," Hartley said. "She wasn't in this room. She didn't see what happened. We did." He turned slightly, just enough to address the staff still frozen across the walls. "There are no titles when a child is struck. There's just the truth." Camilla's son twisted again. "This is absurd. She's acting. She provoked me." "She stood still," Hartley cut in. "You moved." The man looked to the aides, searching for someone, anyone, to side with him. None stepped forward. The protocol officer's eyes remained locked on his notes. The junior liaison had taken a step back, half-shielded by a display panel. Even the security staff by the hall stood like statues, not because they were uncertain, but because they no longer saw a man they answered to. They saw a man being removed. The older officer at his side adjusted his earpiece. "We'll transport him to South Wing Conference Security, awaiting authorization on full report log." Camilla's son snarled under his breath, and then he said it. "She got what she deserved." The line wasn't shouted, but it was loud enough to reach the girl behind the guard. Charlotte didn't react. She didn't speak. But her fingers clenched tightly around the front seam of her coat. That was when the protocol officer finally spoke. His voice was dry, quiet. "I'll be logging that," he said. Camilla's son looked up, surprised to hear from someone he assumed would stay silent. "You'll be what?" The officer cleared his throat. "Article 7, Clause C. Repetition of language minimizing harm after contact. It qualifies as psychological intimidation." "You're logging protocol?" The man laughed. "You think a clipboard matters?" "I think consequences do," the officer replied. The double doors opened fully. The security officers stepped through with him in tow. No violence, no rush, just presence, just removal. No one followed. No one stopped them. Inside the chamber, the silence that followed wasn't stunned anymore. It was institutional. Camilla's son wasn't the first man in that building to forget that the palace wasn't a stage. It was a system. And the system had just moved past him. The door hadn't even finished swinging closed before it opened again. This time, no one turned in confusion. Everyone recognized the cadence of the steps, sharp, measured, unhurried, but unmistakable. Not ceremonial. Not passive. Prince William walked in like he already knew what had happened. He didn't speak as he entered, didn't glance at the aides, didn't scan the room for Camilla's son. His eyes went straight to Charlotte. She was still standing, still behind the guard, still silent. The red on her cheek had darkened now, a harsh diagonal mark that made the tension in the room suddenly feel primitive, like the air itself understood something irreversible had occurred. William's jaw tightened. He took one breath, then looked to Hartley. "What happened, sir?" he asked, voice low. Sergeant Hartley didn't waver. He responded without hesitation, military flat and fully official. "Sir, Camilla's son struck Her Royal Highness across the face in front of witnesses. I ordered his immediate detainment. He has been escorted to secure holding in the south wing." William's expression didn't shift. He turned to Charlotte. Her eyes finally lifted to meet his. Her voice was steady when she answered, before he could even ask. "He got angry when I said I wouldn't bow." William held her gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once, almost imperceptibly. "Did he touch you before that?" She answered with a small nod. "He tried. I told him not to." That was all she said. That was all she needed to. William's posture straightened. He looked to the protocol officer. "Full statement log. Everyone who witnessed this, document their accounts. Start with the security feed. I want everything pulled within the hour." The officer nodded, already pulling a notepad from his folder. "And Charlotte?" William stepped forward, crouching slightly, not enough to draw attention, but enough to meet her on her own plane. "Do you want to stay in this room?" he asked gently. Charlotte glanced briefly at the aides, then at the doorway where her uncle had been dragged away. "No," she said. William turned to one of the aides. "Take her to the private reception parlour. Call Catherine, and have the medical officer check her before she's moved to residence." Charlotte hesitated before walking. She glanced back at Hartley. He didn't move, didn't speak, but he gave a slow, short nod. She walked with the aide without looking back again. Only when she was gone did William rise to full height. He turned to Hartley. "You were the one who shouted the arrest." "I was, sir." William nodded once. "Good!" There was a beat of silence. Then William said, "She's a child, and she stood her ground. I expect that from her. But no one should have to stand alone." "She didn't," Hartley said. William's eyes held on him for a long moment. Then he gave the faintest nod. "Stay with this process," he said. "See it through." "I will, sir." As William turned to leave, the aides parted without being told. The corridor beyond the antechamber had already shifted. The institution had reacted. But the man who represented it, he had just taken a side. And that meant everything had changed. The room didn't resume. No one reset the chairs. No one picked up the clipboard. No one suggested finishing the rehearsal. Because no one knew what part of the schedule applied when a royal guard had just shouted for a royal to be arrested. And no one, not even the seasoned aides, wanted to be the one to ask. Charlotte was escorted to the reception parlour with quiet precision. The medical officer arrived within minutes, bag in hand, face unreadable. Her examination was gentle, brief, and didn't require questions. There was a mark, there would be bruising, but no swelling, no broken skin, no need for medication. Charlotte didn't speak much. She asked for a glass of water. She sat upright. She did not cry. Across the palace, word was already moving faster than the official statements ever would. Courtiers texted assistants. Staff whispered outside elevators. One phrase repeated itself in hallway conversations and murmured exchanges. "He hit her." No one said his name. They didn't need to. Back in the antechamber, the aides finally began to move. One collected the clipboard and quietly rolled the rehearsal program back into its case. Another removed the gold-tipped mark from the tile floor. The liaison returned to her station by the door, though she looked like she might faint if anyone asked her to speak. Hartley stood exactly where he'd stopped, feet planted, posture upright, expression neutral. He hadn't returned to formation. He wasn't sure he ever would. The guard's duty had always been ceremonial in appearance, but it was never just for show. Today had proven that. He wasn't sure the monarchy knew what that meant yet, but Charlotte did. Camilla did not appear. Whether she'd been informed or had chosen to remain distant, no one knew. No statement was issued. No correction was offered. No one arrived to explain what the child had misunderstood. Because there was no misunderstanding left. Charlotte remained under quiet protection for the rest of the day. She was visited only by her mother and one trusted aide. Her brothers were not told in detail, though George, sharp-eyed and too observant for his age, asked why her cheek was red. She told him, "It's already being taken care of." And for once it was. By sunset, the detainment was formalised. The palace issued an internal safeguarding brief, never intended for public release, that confirmed physical contact had been made, a minor had been harmed, and immediate protective action had been executed without delay. No headlines followed, not yet. But inside the institution, lines had been drawn in ink. Charlotte didn't bring it up again. Not that night, not the next morning, not when she passed through the same hallway 2 days later. But she did stop at the portrait of Queen Elizabeth that hung just outside the Rose Gallery. She stood there a moment longer than usual, then walked on without a word. The man who had stood for her, who had not asked or hesitated or checked the rules, was back on his post 3 days later. He didn't speak when she passed. He didn't need to. But she paused just long enough to say one thing: "Thank you for not leaving." Hartley didn't smile, didn't bow, just answered with what mattered. "It was my job." And this time, everyone understood what that meant. Should a royal guard ever override tradition? If it means protecting a royal child? Was Charlotte right to take a stand for her brothers, even if it meant disobeying protocol? And once violence entered the room, did the guard act too fast? Or did he act just in time? Let us know what you would have done in the comments. We read every single one. While you're here, tap like if this story moved you. Subscribe to the channel if you want to see justice when no one else is watching. And don't forget to ring the bell icon so you never miss the moment a guard moves before anyone else does. Share this video with someone who still believes the uniform is just for show. And check out the next Royal Guard story now appearing on your screen. We'll see you tomorrow, same time, same place, with a brand new story.